Good morning, everyone. My name is James Kim, and I'm a research fellow at the Asan Institute for Policy Studies. Welcome to the second session. Before we begin our panel, what I think is a captivating topic, I wanted to take a few minutes of our time to introduce our speakers. As you'll see, our conference coordinators have done it again with another star-studded lineup. If we had more time, I would love to give you the full bio, but we don't have this luxury, unfortunately. So I'll give you an abbreviated version and ask you to refer to our program for a more thorough accounting. To my left is Charlie Cook, who is widely published and recognized for his work as the editor and publisher of the Cook Political Report, which since its founding in 1984 has a very large following, including myself. To his left is Kim Jiyoon, who is a research fellow and the director of our Public Opinion Studies Center. She's trained as a political behavioralist specializing in public opinion-related research, but she is more recently known for her work managing and running our public opinion surveys and the survey team, which from what I hear in the DC community is very popular. Just a little plug-in because I'm a company man. Some of what she's probably going to talk about may even be mentioned in the published report that's outside in the publication table. So a little plug-in for Asan. Third on our speaker list, next to the left of Dr. Kim, is Bruce Klingner. Is currently the Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. His 20 years of experience working in the intelligence community dealing with Asia and in particular Korea-related issues has won him a large following in the media as well as the policymaking community. Lastly, but not least, William Tobey is the Senior Fellow at the Belfer Center in Harvard University. But he's also known for his past role as the Deputy Administrator for Defense and Non-Proliferation at the National Nuclear Security Administration, as well as his work in the National Security Council. So, our panel for this hour is entitled Public Opinion, Alliance, Security, Nukes. And there are many things that we can cover on this topic, I think. We can debate the significance of or the role of public opinion in foreign policymaking, if there is any. But we could also maybe begin with some general baseline understanding about public opinion on these issues in both the U.S. and South Korea. So what I'll ask each speakers to do is take about 5 to 7, maybe 10, depending on if they have some interesting data they really want to get in there, to say a few words about these topics. We may have some, and then open up the floor for questions. So, Mr. Cook.
Thank you, James. It's a real pleasure to be here at the forum. I had the good fortune in May of 2010 to visit the Republic of Korea with the Asan Foundation, and it was really an exciting trip for me to really see an economic powerhouse in what's truly one of the real success stories economically and politically of the second half of the 20th century and into the 21st century. Just a really vibrant economy and culture spreading throughout Asia and throughout the world, and goes even beyond Gangnam-style dancing. With 1.7 million Korean Americans, Korea is becoming a part of the tapestry of America. That the diversity that we see here, and we are now incorporating that into America's society. But the country has changed. The Republic of Korea has changed so much over the last 60 years since the armistice, and it truly is a part. A friend of mine says this is not your grandfather's Korea. The relations between the United States and Korea have never been better, more healthy, a partnership in every sense of the word, and a vibrant bilateral relationship. The Korea-U.S. trade agreement, I think, absolutely cements this, as well as the recent visit by President Park. We see the evidence of that partnership and economic integration between two close allies. And I think this agreement was really, really important because it was a confidence builder on both sides of the Pacific, and it put a floor under trade and economic relations and sort of put a lot of economic policy issues into the solved box. encouraging greater cross-investment between the two countries. Koreans are now buying U.S. computers and electronics, chemicals, machinery, while Americans are buying Korean telephones, motor vehicles, and semiconductors. It's truly a win-win relationship, $100 billion trade volume in 2011. President Park's recent visit to the United States and address the joint session of Congress on May 8th, excuse me, getting over a cold, reinforced the image that's already been developing of a confident and competent leader with a strong personal relationship with President Obama. And I think for the 53% of Americans who are women, noting that Korea elected a woman president before we did did not go unnoticed. The North's recent threats have only magnified U.S.-Korea security cooperation. And Korea has shown that it can, and I think the most important thing that's happened in recent years is that Korea has shown that you can simultaneously develop good relations with both China and the United States, that it's not about making a choice or to choose between two superpowers. And that some would argue that for China, probably one of the greatest foreign policy developments of recent years has been its development of a close relationship with Korea. In fact, some half-jokingly say that if the Chinese had to pick 70 years ago which country on the Korean peninsula to choose sides with, they might have made a different choice had it to do all over again. But there is no light between the United States and Korea in terms of security. Having said that, and underscoring the no light between the United States and Korea, it's important for Korea and other allies around the globe to appreciate that the United States has effectively been at war for the last 12 years. Between Iraq and Afghanistan, this is the longest period of time, continuous period of time, this country has ever been at war. Indeed, if you take the length of the Civil War and add in the length of World War I and World War II, we have now been at war longer than than the American involvement in those three combined. Tremendous number of lives, tremendous treasure has been lost in this country due to those wars, and with an impact on both our federal budget and our national psyche. There is profound war fatigue that's taken place, with some elements of isolation now drifting into American public opinion. And that's why I think it's important for our allies to understand the political realities that come from a country that's been at war for so long. The damage to our finances, particularly given that these were the first and second wars in American history that have not been paid for by taxes raised for the express purpose of paying for that war. In other words, we had two wars that we put on a credit card, and the United States has never done that before. These wars have depleted the United States both economically and emotionally, and while if a close ally like the Republic of Korea were attacked without provocation, the United States would certainly rise to defend Korea. Polls show that a majority of Americans clearly support sending more U.S. troops to Korea if the South were attacked by the North, but it would not be without enthusiasm. Americans are hardly anxious to get into another fight anywhere in the world. Witness the controversy around whether the United States should get involved in Syria or not. But it's equally important for those who would be our adversaries to know that we will stand up for our good friends, including and especially the Republic of Korea. And just as it's important for Korea and all of our security partners to understand the domestic political realities, the dynamics of American public opinion and its nuances, it's also important for American leaders to understand public opinion in the countries that are in our allied countries. That is why the Asan Institute for Policy Studies' new Public Opinion Studies Center is so important, giving American and other policymakers, diplomats, business leaders, and military leaders, as well as academicians, a greater understanding of the hopes, fears, and concerns of the Korean public. And the new monthly seminars that the center is running in Seoul, I think, I understand, is doing a great job, and that has become very, very popular among particularly a lot of the people in the embassy in terms of really having a pulse on South Korean public opinion. The work of the Institute on that and other things, it's so important for us to have a better and more sophisticated understanding of one of our closest friends. Again, I want to thank the Asan Institute for everything it does, and particularly for their work in terms of bringing
So, Jiyoon, maybe you could fill in a little bit more on that work?
We built it up for you here.
I don't know what to say. First of all, it's my great honor to be here and be part of this wonderful event. I joined Asan like almost 3 years ago, and since then I was in charge of the Public Opinion Studies Center. And then I go to work, and there's an influx of numbers because we started a daily poll last year. And I work on the numbers, and then I go back to home with the numbers. So you cannot imagine how exciting my life is. So we're conducting various kinds of surveys. First of all, as I mentioned, the daily poll, we're tracking the records like job approval rating of the president and party supports. And also we have the annual survey, which is the most comprehensive one. It covers not just the foreign relations and foreign policies, but also the domestic politics, economics, and also social values. And also we have some breaking polls if there's any contingencies. And last year was an election, big election year for Korea. So we conducted a 7-way panel studies. And in all these polls, we asked repeatedly the one question, which is on alliance with the United States. And like whether or not they support for the alliance, and what about after the unification, what do you think about the presence of military troops in Korean Peninsula? Well, I can present some numbers of how people think about the alliance, but they're already in the report, which is available outside the conference room, so you can just pick one up on the way out. Just briefly say some important numbers in the report. I can say that the relationship between Korea and the United States cannot get any better now. So when we asked whether or not they support for the alliance, 92% of Koreans, they say they support the alliance, which is an amazing number, but understandable, I mean, considering that the continuous provocation, the false necessity about the alliance and the power by the United States are most necessary. But when you ask, what about after unification then? Then the answer was 70% of Koreans actually said, even after unification, once the North Korean threat is gone, they still want to have alliance with the United States. Well, I mean, there's a lot of explanation for that, but we largely find the reason in China, which is the country which is perceived to be taking side with North Korea in the wake of the war again. And also, this is the country perceived to be the most threatening after unification by Korean people. And well, there's one question we asked to the respondents, so which country do you think is the most influential? So by asking them to mark the score from 0 to 10 scale, so 0 is the least influential in the world, and the 10 is the most influential in the world. And currently, Korean people gave the score, the highest score to the United States, which is 8.7. And it's followed by China, which is a 7.6. But when we asked, what about in the future, like in 10 years? And then Korean people's, the US score, which was 8.7, down a little bit to 7.9. And about the China, they actually went up to like 8.2. So you can find the reason that the Korean people perceive that now the United States is still the most influential country in the world, but in 10 years, maybe it's going to be changed a little bit. So for all those reasons that we have enough of reason to think that even after unification, North Korean threat is gone, we have some country to be fear of in the region, and that's probably why we need a U.S. alliance, the strong U.S. alliance still. And then also, the favorability score, like we ask the people to also ask the least likely, the country they like least is a 0, and the country like they most is 10. So when we asked them to score it, the U.S. was the first ranked, like scores of over 5. And of course, the fact that the competing countries are North Korea and Japan and China probably doesn't make you feel that great. But still, if you recollecting what happened 11 years ago, like in 2002, which largely also decided the presidential election result, then you can, I think that both countries kind of deserve to be proud of this much improve the situation. One thing I'd like to talk today is, well, yesterday we have heard a lot of concerned voice about the young generation of Korean. which is largely perceived by the Washington community that do not remember what happened in the past and recognize the sacrifices the guys made. And they also believe that may undermine the relationship between the two countries thereby. But our survey result actually is quite revealing on that regard. As I said, 92% of Koreans support the alliance, but the young generation, those in their 20s, the 95% of the young generation actually support the alliance, which is and about the average 70%, but support for the alliance actually among those is much higher than that. So 80% of 20s actually support for the alliance. And then when it comes to how do you support the presence of military troops in Korea, and the 65% of young generation actually supported that too. And 54% of Koreans, or young Koreans, agreed that the military troops' presence in the Korean peninsula, even after unification, which is second to none. So, and about the China, actually we asked the question about the influential score, then what's the stance that the Korea has to take? Whether we have to stay by and to maintain the strong relationship with the traditional ally, which is the United States, or we have to build a new cooperative partnership with China. Maybe this is not something that I can express here, which is celebrating the 60th anniversary of alliance between Korea and the United States. But unfortunately, more than 60% of Koreans actually thought we have to establish a new partnership with China. And another surprising point is that that idea is largely coming from the elderly, not the young generation. More than 60% of young generation, particularly so, those who are in their 20s, they think that we still have to stick by and maintain the strong alliance with the United States. So it seems that all the figures sounds like very much coming from the strategic regions, but it's not all. For example, like a favorability rating of the United States perceived by the young Koreans, it is 6.20. It's a score only surpassed by that of those in the 60s, the elderly generation, whose score was 6.89, which is almost impossible to beat, I guess. And also there's quite interesting finding. We have a hypothetical soccer match when we asked between the two neighboring countries, and we asked, okay, there's a hypothetical soccer match between these countries, and which country are you going to root for? This idea is originally coming from the study done by the Professor Jiyoon at the Stanford University in 1990. In 1990, when there's a hypothetical soccer match between North Korea and the United States, 83% of Koreans actually chose North Korea to root for over the United States. When we repeated this question this year, 58% of Koreans actually chose the United States over North Korea. This is really dramatic change, I have to say. But another surprising finding is that among those who are in their 20s, 70% of the Koreans who are in their 20s chose United States over the North Korea to root for in this hypothetical soccer match. And when there's the match between China and the United States, 88% of the young generation chose, of course, the United States over China. It is the largest gap across the age groups. So all in all, it seems that the Korean people, particularly the young generation, I don't think there's any worry for you guys to what's going to be of those in 20s. And the most progressive segment of population is the people who are in their 40s. And of course, you can remember that this is a generation of 386, the most progressive who went through the democratization process, etc. But this young generation has a really friendly attitude toward the United States. Another thing I would like to note is that what they see in the relations between Korea and the United States. Of course, when we ask what is the most important component of the relationship, That is military alliance, of course. 43% of Koreans chose a military alliance. It's the most important matter in the relationship between these two countries, and followed by, of course, economic cooperation. But there's a kind of matter of differences, like across the groups, age groups. So the young generations, the 20s and the 30s and 40s, just to include myself in those category, young generation, they have rather broader perspective on those relations. For example, 10% or 13% of those groups think that environmental protection is another field that we have to work on together, and also cooperation in science and technology is one of the things that to broaden our horizon of cooperation. So to conclude, I think we are going to deal with really different species in the future. Those in the 20s, they are the people who is security-wise very conservative as those in the 60s, but very liberal in other many respects, social issues and economic issues. And they have less strong ethno-nationalistic sentiment to North Korea for obvious reasons. And while the elderly is threatened by China, the rise of China, and even disproportionately believe that we have to establish new cooperative partnership with them. But those in the 20s and young generation, they are more confident in the Korea's capability to cope with these challenges from this gigantic country. And then, they are also ready to work on other aspects other than the military alliance with the United States. So maybe it is too premature to say anything about the post-unification, but even without that assumption, I think a more extended and broadened the range of cooperation between Korea and the United States is absolutely in need for the sake of another strong 6 decades. Let me stop there.
Well, thank you, Jiyoon, for that real great overview on South Korea's public opinion. And interesting to mention there something about some long-term trends, and also among the younger cohorts, some interesting trends that we really wouldn't have known if it wasn't revealed in your presentation. So I know you follow some of this also, Bruce, and on both sides of the pond. So maybe you could fill in on maybe some of the things that were missing in the discussion, along with the U.S.
Well, thank you very much. One thing I noticed yesterday is near the end of some of the panels, someone in the back would stand up and hold up this big sign, "Please stop talking." So I'm hoping not to get the sign, and I think
you have some time, Bruce.
And I think, unfortunately, I think my wife wants to get a copy of that so she can use it. We'll see. Well, first of all, on polls, obviously they're a useful tool in identifying and assessing opinions and moods and trends in South Korea and the United States, and the concerns of the populace. And in that way, they're a useful barometer to use as they serve on behalf of their constituents. That said, though, I think we have to keep in mind a number of caveats about polls. Is that they represent a snapshot opinion at one time of a small slice of the population, and that we shouldn't overinvest or overinterpret any one poll because the populace is very fickle. Just a couple South Korean examples is several years ago there were a poll asking the same question several weeks in a row: which country is the biggest threat to peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula? And within several weeks, it was North Korea, then it was Japan, then it was the United States. So nothing had changed, but the views of the people obviously had. Another example is at the tail end of the Kim Dae-jung administration's public support for the Sunshine Policy was very low. I remember, I think, 17%. And then an event happened on the peninsula which caused a major resurgence in support for the Sunshine Policy. And that was the tragic death of the 2 schoolgirls by an American armored vehicle. That led to a surge during the presidential campaign of anti-Americanism, which No Myung-hun played up, and then it led to a surge in support for reaching out to North Korea. Obviously unrelated issues, but it had caused a major change in public opinion. Also, polls can be contradictory. Another Korean example is after the Cheonan report came out, 70% of the people believed that North Korea had sank the Cheonan. At the same time, 70% of the people didn't believe the report that said North Korea had sank the Cheonan. And a lot of it was sort of feeling against Lee Myung-bak, that he was playing this up as a political issue. So really contradictory information. Also, polls can give you numbers, but they don't give you analysis, and it leaves things open for interpretation or misinterpretation as the cause for those numbers. And then also, even with consistent poll numbers, the majority view might be the majority, but that doesn't make it right. Just last week, President Park Geun-hye bemoaned that 69% of South Korean teenagers believed South Korea had invaded the North in 1950 to start the Korean War. Now, with all of that being said, what do some of the polls show? What are some of the trends in South Korea? First of all, obviously very strong support for Park Geun-hye right now, 60%. And to put it in a context, think of what the numbers were for Lee Myung-bak at a similar time during his first year in office, because right now we'd be right at about the height of the anti-U.S. beef demonstration. So obviously his numbers were much lower, and so Park Geun-hye has weathered sort of, controversies over some of her political choice or her selections for cabinet officers, et cetera. So she's doing very, very well. And we can sort of interpret why that is. Well, in large part, it's because of that she was seen as obviously offering a hand of dialogue to North Korea, just as Lee Myung-bak and just as Barack Obama had done, and really the over-the-top nature of the North Korean threats, and that there was also very strong support for her very resolute response to the North Korean actions, the threats against the United States and South Korea and Japan. And that also the opposition is imploding. There really is no viable opposition figure right now, a progressive candidate or a progressive party or the progressive philosophy. After Yongpyeong-do, really the progressive advocacy for reaching out to North Korea largely unconditionally really suffered a major setback. A second trend, there's a much better opinion of the United States and a much stronger support for the alliance than before. In 2012, 95% of South Koreans expressed support for maintaining the alliance. As Jiyoon said, even after unification, there's a very strong support given the increasing concern about a rising China and its increasing belligerence. Also, progressives are much more supportive, or at least less critical of the United States than they were before. Progressives supporting the alliance 10 years ago was only 30%, and now that's doubled to 60%. And certainly there's a much stronger view of the United States than of Japan. Last year, 4 times as many South Koreans viewed Japan unfavorably as they viewed North Korea unfavorably. The third trend is that there's less support for engaging North Korea, or at least engaging North Korea unconditionally. The Yongpyeong-do really caused a major shift in South Korean public opinion away from conciliation and providing aid to North Korea. And that in December 2010, shortly after Yongpyeong-do, 70% of the South Koreans supported a military response to North Korea, whereas only 30% had supported such a response after the Cheonan sinking. Now, if you compare those numbers with 2006, is that back then 54% of South Koreans wanted U.S. troops out of South Korea. 40% thought South Korea should remain neutral in a conflict between the U.S. and North Korea. And nearly half said South Korea should side with Pyongyang if the U.S. were to attack North Korea. And what we're seeing now is with the release of the transcripts from the 2007 Inter-Korean Summit that Roh Moo-hyun told Kim Jong-il that the United States is the country that most threatens peace and stability on the peninsula. Now, on the other side of the water, what do the U.S. polls show? Well, North Korea's threats this year certainly broke through U.S. complacency about issues on the Korean peninsula, and that Americans followed North Korean issues more than ever. In fact, more Americans Googled on North Korea than they did on Beyonce. Anyway. Also, more importantly, more Americans viewed North Korea as a threat to the United States than ever before. In February, even really before a lot of the threats had begun, 83% saw North Korea's development of nuclear weapons as a critical threat to the vital interests of the United States. Now, what's really important is that was the top of the list of of perceived threats to the United States. Higher than terrorism, which was 1 point lower at 81%, higher than China, 52%, and certainly higher than Russia at 29%. And that by April, during the midst of all these threats, 41% of Americans saw North Korea as an immediate threat, which was up 13 points just from the previous month. And that 56%, it's more than half, should take North Korean threats to use the nukes against the U.S. very seriously. And also Americans were more pessimistic that diplomacy would work in resolving this crisis. Less than half thought diplomacy would work, down from a previous majority who used to believe that diplomacy would work. And that more Americans strongly supported defending South Korea, 60% saying we should use force to help South Korea. Now, by May, when the threats had at least decreased in number, that polls showed that the perception of the North Korean threat was already waning a bit. But we're not going to go back to really complacency about thoughts on the peninsula, because back in 2012, polls showed that for the first time, Americans thought Asia was more important than Europe to the United States. Now, polls will give you views, they'll give you numbers, but they won't give any sense of what the public thinks on how to solve the North Korean problem, or what the public thinks about a long-term strategy towards North Korea. Now, just some final points on polls before I get the stop talking sign. As I said before, polls are a very useful tool, and certainly policymakers should be aware of them and take them into account. But polls really are not a substitute for principles. And that I think politicians, and really anyone for that matter, are most admired when people are seen as sticking to their principles, even in the face of adversity or criticism or disagreement. Think of the movie Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. And so that people who change their opinion at the drop of a hat or a poll, are usually derided as opportunistic or flip-flopping, and that no one really admires someone who says, quick, poll the people, tell me what I think. And No Mi-hun, for example, was criticized as a frog. Well, he sort of looked like one, but it was more in that he was seen as hopping back and forth on his positions, and that he would switch his position based on what the latest public opinion had said. And so finally, I think leaders, real leaders, as opposed to politicians, can and should drive public support rather than merely just reacting to it. And as Margaret Thatcher once said, consensus is the absence of leadership. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Bruce, for some reality check on the public opinion. And I'll up that with another British politician, Winston Churchill, who said the best argument against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with an average voter. But there's an undeniable fact here. The voters vote, they have opinions, and policymakers sometimes listen. How do we reconcile or how do we manage this reality? And maybe Tobey could shed some light on his experience and his expertise with regards to nuclear issues and his views on this as well.
Well, I'll try. I'd like, first of all, to thank the Asan Institute for hosting this conference. I'm a strong supporter of the US-ROK alliance, and I'm deeply grateful to Asan for making the effort to celebrate the alliance. Both the alliance itself and the celebration of it, I believe, are extremely important to both the United States and the Republic of Korea. I agree with much that I've heard from my fellow panelists here, especially the point that I think was last made by Bruce about the importance of principle. I am certainly not an expert on either ROK or U.S. public opinion. I do have some experience in dealing with nuclear issues, including during the Reagan administration when I was on the National Security Council staff, and nuclear issues were extremely controversial. They were a matter of significant public debate, and President Reagan, I think in some cases, actually decided that it was best not to listen to at least the loudest voices of public opinion, which at that point came from advocates of a nuclear freeze and demonstrations against deployments that he thought were necessary to meet the Soviet threat. And so I took from that experience the importance of principle. I think it can be applied to the decisions that confront the ROK today. And I'd make 5 observations about nuclear issues and public opinion. First, Koreans are understandably frustrated with the failure of 20 years of efforts to halt the DPRK nuclear weapons program. We've tried hard, we've tried soft, nothing has worked. And frankly, although it puts me at odds with Chris Hill on the previous panel, I think that it is very unlikely that the current government in North Korea will ever get rid of its nuclear weapons. So, second, South Koreans' frustration understandably leads to a search for policy alternatives. If what we're doing now doesn't work or hasn't worked, what can we do to do better? And Asan Institute research has revealed that 2/3 of South Koreans now favor either the reintroduction of U.S. tactical nuclear weapons onto the Korean peninsula or perhaps even an independent Korean nuclear deterrent. That's an important point that policymakers will have to deal with. But I would point out a couple of other things, which raises my third point. In my view anyway, neither alternative is militarily necessary. The U.S. and ROK conventional forces are more than a match for the DPRK. The U.S. nuclear weapons already serve as a deterrent against the North. So nuclear weapons in the ROK would not necessarily improve the military balance. Now that's not the only reason one might contemplate such alternatives, which leads to my fourth point. Such policies might apply more pressure to China and indirectly then achieve a better result with the North. And I can't gainsay that hypothesis. And in fact, I've made the argument to the Chinese that the North Korean nuclear weapons program actually works against Chinese interests in important aspects of what the Chinese describe as their own interests. It makes the United States and its allies closer. It increases our interest in missile defenses, and it increases the salience of nuclear weapons. It probably makes the continued presence of U.S. Forces on the Korean Peninsula more likely rather than less likely for many of the reasons related to public opinion that have been cited today. But an independent South Korean nuclear deterrent would come at some cost, and I think needs to be considered in evaluating the policy alternatives. It would erode the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It might lead to contemplation of a similar alternative by other nations in the region. Japan or Vietnam might consider that their alternatives should include a nuclear weapons program. And if we find ourselves in a situation in which East Asia has many more nuclear states, I think international security will be diminished. So that would lead to my fifth point, which would be that the United States and ROK governments need to design policies that are credible alternatives that will persuade the South Korean public that there are ways to deal with the North Korean nuclear program. And I would offer several alternatives, although I wouldn't say that these are exclusive. And these would include increased missile defenses in South Korea. We see that Japan is quite active in deploying missile defenses for reasons that I don't understand, and perhaps people here can explain to me. South Korea has exhibited less interest in missile defense. I think by the same token, increasing the Republic of Korea's actual offensive missile capabilities is important to do. I know the request was made of the United States, and I think I hope that goes forward. I think that exercising the U.S. nuclear deterrent is an important aspect of underlining, not undermining, the credibility of extended deterrence. And the recent B-2 and F-22 flights, I think, did that. And I would hope that things like that continue. Pardon me. And then finally, I think a long-term strategy built on the vision that Dr. Hom outlined yesterday for peace and security in Northeast Asia is one that really provides the ultimate strategic success in this area. And I think strengthening that as a goal that would appeal to the Korean public would be an important step.
Well, thank you very much for that assessment. The floor is open to questions. We have, I believe, only a few minutes, so unless, if there are no questions, yes, there are questions. Please, can you, when you ask, use the microphone, please, and
Yes.
please state who you are.
My name is Christoph Blut. I'm from the University of Leeds in the UK. I've studied quite a lot of the academic publications on surveys in South Korea. And one of the interesting features is that even at times when there was a very high level of distrust of the United States, nevertheless, there still seemed to be generally a majority in favor of the alliance. In other words, there was a distinction between what they thought of America and the alliance. At least that seems to be in the existing academic literature. But the interesting question is, how does this translate into policy? Because how does public opinion translate into the political system? And we have a very clear and very strong divide about the understanding of the identity of the Korean nation, the sources and causes of the problem of North Korea, and what should be done about it. And that has expressed itself in the South Korean politics over the last 20 years. The system, I think, is to some extent dysfunctional because of the division between the executive and the legislative, especially in cases when they are of a different party. But what I think has become very clear, and I think this is good news, is that those voices in South Korea which oppose the alliance or which want to change the alliance basically cannot get enough traction within the political system. I think that's my conclusion from my studies, and I'd be interested to hear your opinions about this, but I think that's good news for the US-ROK alliance.
Was that kind of comment? There were some questions kind of laced in there. Anybody want to weigh in on that? Or we could take other questions because we have some limited time. There are hands in the back. Thomas Christensen, I think.
Yeah, thanks for the excellent presentations. My question's to Jiyoon. I was somewhat heartened by your discussion of the 20-plus generation in Korea. I guess there's two potential problems, though. One problem is if young Koreans don't take the security challenge from North Korea seriously enough, and that could harm the alliance, and you suggest that that's not the case. So that's one set of problems, and you reassured me that that set of problems is not as dire as some people think. The second set of problems is more on a political and humanitarian level, though, and this is what worries me, would be if young South Koreans started to see North Korea as a totally foreign issue, that they are no longer part of the same nation, and therefore they become less concerned about the humanitarian and political problems to the north to the degree that they just don't care about it. And I don't know whether your soccer findings suggest that the latter may be the case. And if it is, then I would worry, even as I'm reassured that they see North Korea as a potential threat that would bolster the US-ROK alliance, something I believe very strongly. So thanks for your response.
So I believe the question is related to the youth, the changing views of the youth, and what it means for relations with North Korea and its impact on the alliance. Any thoughts?
Well, from my panel, there's two people actually raised some criticism of the pollings, and thanks Bruce and having our honorary chairman present and sitting over there, and you guys are really doing a serious job security threat. I totally agree with Bruce's comments, and the people are very fickle. They change their mind, their opinions quite frequently, but he showed us tendencies, which is remarkable tendency of how we have changed from 10 years ago, and also agreed that it can change by the external shock that we cannot control, but it also can change by the external shock that we can control. For example, I believe that the people's perception of the United States, favorability, and also the support for the alliance, of course, the provocation by North Korea have a huge influence on that. But also, I believe that there's a continuous effort made by USFK to improve the public relations with the Korean civilians. For example, I remember that Commander Thurman, he put a lot of effort and pay close attention to what Korean people think whenever there's any misdemeanor by U.S. soldiers against the Korean civilians. I remember that after those two kind of high-profile rape crimes against Korean women, they put the military curfew back. And also, he decided to, at the very beginning of this year, he decided to put it indefinitely. And very most recently, he actually put more enforced way, 1 to 5 a.m. daily basis. So, and then that kind of action, it's maybe not a big policy, but that kind of small action is really well received by the Korean public. And secondly, about how accurate that is. I mean, there's a small sample of segment, it might be, but that's the part, and methodologically, we try to be most accurate. And also, you have an example, like young South Koreans believe that the South Korea actually invaded North Korea. That is actually the problem of the wording of the questions, which is very incorrectly worded. And this is a typical case of mistake that posters can make. About the Professor Christensen's question, those young generations and Koreans, they do not really feel the security challenges from North Korea, which is not true, actually. They are the people. Yeah. The second, like how they feel about the North Korea, and then how do you feel it as a foreign policy or just they're very close to the brotherhood. This is true. They feel more distant from the North Korea, of course, for obvious reason. They do not have any memory of being one country and one nation, one people. And when we ask them, what do you see in North Korea, and actually only 15% of Koreans feel that we are the one nation. They are the one of us. And it's even much less for those who are in the 20s. And that is also, they believe that it is much better to live together, coexist peacefully without invading or hurting each other. So they do not particularly want unification. They're not particularly interested in unification. And if there is any unification, we don't need to hurry, or maybe not necessary at all. That's kind of sentiment shared by the young generation of Korea. And the last but not least, the public opinion poll is just another communication tool between the political elite and the public. This is a representative democracy, and we have an election to show our opinions, but we don't have an election every day or every year. Sometimes, the most frequent one in the United States every 2 years. But this is just showing how people think, and It's just a barometer, and it gives some directions for the political elite of what to do. I think I largely agree with you. I mean, policymakers, they have to abide by what they believe. And sometimes the public opinion support your idea. Sometimes they do not. They have to, act in principle that belief. And when these principles goes against or goes opposed to what public believes, I think they have to do something to inform them and some extensive some knowledges. For example, like a nuclear program, developmental nuclear program in South Korea. It is true. I mean, 62% of South Koreans would like to have our own nuclear weapons because of North Korean threat, because we believe that it's going to enhance our status in the international community. We learned it from North Korea. But when we are informed some other aspects, maybe there's some restriction. If we have a nuclear weapons program, maybe there's some restrictions on the nuclear energy development and exporting nuclear technology, then there's a possibility that people can think twice. So without that effort, I think it's a little bit premature to determine that it is not really useless just to defend my job.
Well, just to provide a little bit of perspective, the South Koreans are, having been retransplanted to South Korea, they're very serious about soccer. This is a very serious issue. So indirect way of getting at some of these issues, using something that is more kind of more at home for an average Korean, rather than, even though, North Korea is right next door, maybe these issues kind of get at it from another angle, these kinds of questions. So Bruce has been interested.
I've been intrigued with the sort of the younger generation as I've talked to Koreans about it. In addition to the regionalism in South Korea, there's certainly differences of view by age sort of striation. So the older generation is more conservative. The 386ers are more progressive. And the younger generation, when I've asked, okay, even what's their name? And people say, well, they're really so individualistic that they don't really want a name. So there have been a lot of different names. The 1929 generation, those between 19 and 29, or the 20, 30. But anyway, they tend to be more conservative, but not necessarily perhaps conservative with a capital C, meaning automatic support for the Saenuri party. They tend to assess their views on an issue more on an issue-by-issue basis rather than a collective progressive view or a collective conservative view. Also, they're much more focused on being entrepreneurial. How does it impact their pocketbook? How do they make money? So if you look at the public opinion polls for unification, support for unification, very strong amongst the older generation, less so with the 386ers, and the least amongst the younger, the college age or recently graduated cohort. And I think they tend to see North Korea more as a separate country, whereas older generation still sees it as part of the northern half of their own country. So there's more a sense of it's a separate country, and if we unify, it's going to have a big impact on the South Korean national economy and my economy, in that it's going to be a drain on my ability to make money or get a job. So I think there's a number of factors going into it.
Charlie, you have a particular perspective on the U.S. side. You follow some of the district level characteristics, and in the U.S. you have not age. Well, there's the age factor as well on some of these issues, but it could also be broadly regional, like geographically. You might see certain kinds of interesting variations in certain states or certain districts. If you could maybe elaborate on these to some extent, how they might play into foreign policy perspectives of policymakers on the Hill, if at all.
Well, we obviously have large regional differences around the United States with some. Actually, let me view it through speak about it through a different prism. Think of Ron Paul for a second. Not that he's representative of anything, but that here you had a presidential candidate that was isolationist on one level, libertarian, just sort of didn't think government should do anything, and then more traditional conservative, and then whatever is Fed bashing the Federal Reserve Board, but he was this sort of odd mix of a bunch of different things simultaneously. Now, usually you don't have one person sort of pulled four different directions like that, but I think if you look at the United States, it does sort of through that prism, you could say there are some people that are isolationist always, and they were, they've been there that way their entire adult life, and it really doesn't matter what's going on in terms of international politics. Then you have people that became somewhat isolationist as a result of the Iraq or maybe Iraq and Afghanistan wars. And then you have people that, they are that those wars make them predisposed, sort of raises the burden of what it would take for them to back U.S. involvement in some place. So I look at it just simply as tiers, and those tiers, the depth of each tier varies enormously from one state to another, from one region to the other, and obviously are very different between the parties. And but if you were going to, I guess, start all over again, we probably ought to be 4 or 5 different countries with the very different philosophies you see in different parts of the country. But it makes it very difficult to make any generalizations, because for every, you make a statement, then you can think of 3 exceptions off the top of your head.
Okay. Just so that we have some balance, we want to be bipartisan. On the right-hand side of the room, there was a hand somewhere.
Hi, Troy Sayer with the Korea Economic Institute. I guess since we were using some quippy phrases earlier, politics is the art of the possible. And, I'd just be curious to push you, Bruce, a little bit more, since you kind of ended on sort of a note that, I believe the quote was from Margaret Thatcher, that consensus is the absence of leadership. It would seem, though, that the reverse is true as well, that consensus is a sign of leadership. So I guess where do you draw the line kind of in terms of in terms of public polling, do politicians need to look at in terms of understanding what is possible and what is not possible, what can be shaped and what cannot be shaped? I mean, it seems to me that public opinion polling plays a large role in helping politicians perhaps avoid mistakes and avoid challenges, because oftentimes the public can be more wise than the politician. So I guess if you wouldn't mind sort of explaining your philosophy a little bit more and kind of getting into more detail on where it plays a role and where it doesn't. Thank you.
So this question, I believe, is for maybe Bruce, and maybe Will could weigh in as well.
Yeah, I guess the answer is going to be it depends on the issue. It's a balance. I mean, certainly polls and public opinion itself is incredibly important. I mean, it is the will of the people on whose behalf the elected officials serve. So, clearly it is something that should be taken into account, particularly if it reflects, I think, a longer trend. Polls can be influenced by a recent event or the wording of it, as Jiyoon said. So clearly you don't want to go against the will of the people for any extended period of time. On the other hand, you don't want to just be a weather vane saying, as I said before, is, quick, poll the people, tell me what I should think and what I should firmly believe in. So it is a balance. And I guess it would have to depend on the politician and on the issue. So there are times, I think, when a leader has to say, well, I know it's not popular, but I think it's for the good of the country. I'm willing to take the heat, either if it fails or if it's unpopular, and either at the next election or not. I will try to switch public opinion because I think this is a very important issue that serves the country, and therefore, you either you get caught up and you lose the election, or you lose huge amounts of public support, which then reduces your own political capital, or it's something that if you sort of wade through the swamp, get to the other side, and are successful, then usually it causes a huge upsurge in public support. So I know that's not a good answer, but I think it is weighing the will or the views of the people with what the politician also firmly believes in, for which they were elected by the people.
And to be fair, you mentioned the differences on the issues, and Bruce, that these could differ depending on the issue. Obviously, for those complex issues which public don't have enough information on, kind of issue that Tobey had earlier talked about on some of these technical issues related to nuclear issues, for instance. Maybe there really doesn't have enough information to really weigh in and useful or positive manner. But Will, do you want to elaborate maybe a little bit?
I agree with that. I believe the nuclear issues are ones in which politicians can exercise leadership. It's already been pointed out that public opinion can be pretty volatile on these issues, so we know it can change, and we also know from experience that politicians are able to change it. So I would say that national security issues are sufficiently important that politicians should probably figure out what they believe and how best to get to the goals that they seek, and then try and lead the public to it. I would say through credible policy alternatives, which was my original suggestion.
Question from here.
I wanted to ask Charlie about the governance and political implications of the dramatic shift of the Asian American vote in the United States. 1992, H.W. Bush won that vote by 66%. This last election, Obama won by a bigger percentage than he did even with Hispanics. And considering that this is an electorate which is considered small business entrepreneurs, anti-communist, and social religious conservatives, that seemed to have taken a lot of work by the Republicans to throw it away.
I'm glad to have a question about something I actually know something about. I was feeling lonely. You know, if you had asked me 2 years ago, we know how African Americans tend to vote. We know how Latinos tend to vote, although it's shifted since the immigration issue has come to the forefront. But if somebody had asked me 2 or 3 years ago, how do Asians vote? And I probably would have had a perplexed look on my face, and I probably would have said, well, let's see. Japanese Americans typically vote more Democratic, and Vietnamese Americans typically vote a little more Republican, and Chinese Americans, Korean Americans, I wouldn't have been so sure, because I could have found examples in each direction. I think and as you said, Asian Americans voted by 2 percentage points more for Obama than Latinos did. Now, for a group that heretofore had not been perceived as terribly partisan or ideological, that's pretty startling. And when I have conversations with Republicans, Republican elected officials, I like to use the Asian Americans as an example because for the most part, let's face it, the immigration debate isn't about Asian Americans. I mean, it just isn't. Let's just be truthful here. But I think that you see a lot of Asian Americans that are hearing the debate over immigration and related issues, and even though it's not aimed at them per se, what they hear is a lot of people, not everyone on the Republican side, that's very certain, and not all conservatives, but they've seen some pretty high-profile conservatives and Republicans say things that suggest to them that they don't seem to like anyone that doesn't look just like them. Now, while that, I believe, is an unfair characterization of both Republicans and conservatives, I can certainly see how that impression comes across and why you would see the Asian American vote tilt very, very, very strongly in one direction that one might not have guessed before. And as you pointed out, and you stole some of my good points I usually would make, that you're talking about a group that's entrepreneurial, capitalistic, has a higher household income than whites, has a lower unemployment rate than whites, as you said, conservative on social cultural issues. This is a group that's made to order for Republicans. And if Republicans are pushing them away, even inadvertently, that should be a sign, you know what, maybe we're doing something wrong here. And I think that actually is one of the most compelling cases for why Republicans need to kind of check the box and do something on immigration and get this the hell off the table, because they're one of the things I learned growing up in the South is when you're in a hole, stop digging. And, I think it's very important for Republicans to stop digging, both in terms of the hole for Asian Americans as well as Latinos.
I think we got a few more minutes. One last question, actually, all the way at the end.
I'm Glenn Fukushima with the Center for American Progress. I have a specific question for Dr. Kim. You understandably focused in your analysis on the South Korean public opinion poll results with regard to the U.S. and China and North Korea. Could you elaborate a bit on the results regarding Japan, and especially about the young people? The reason I ask the question is there's some people in Japan who believe that the younger generation in South Korea and in Japan are more flexible, and so the future is rather bright. Others would argue that because of the history textbooks in both countries, that actually the possibility of the young generation becoming more flexible toward each other is more remote. What do your public opinion polls findings show with regard to the youth attitudes towards Japan and South Korea? Thank you.
Well, can I be politically incorrect here?
Yes. You can be whatever you want to be. Until like 2011 surveys, the Korean people's attitude toward Japan was rather good, basically. Of course, in the favorable ratings, etc., the score was lower than the United States, but was highest among the young generation, basically. And the same tendency is found in the 2012 with the opinion polls too. And then the period we did, the 2012 public opinion, was September and October 2012, which was after the visit to Dr. Takeshima was made by the President Lee Myung-bak. And then the tension was going on between those two countries. Namely, it's not really good timing to measure how they exactly feel about Japan. I can say that the young generation, particularly when you compare with those who are the 60s and older, they have much better attitude and opinion on Japan. So, for example, like the scores, and then when we asked the match between North Korea and Japan, and U.S. and Japan even, it shows that a more favorable view to Japan. But I don't really think there's a kind of resolution on the history and textbook issues, even among the young generation. While they may not feel as offended as those in the 60s and over, but still, it is kind of inherited generation by generation, even to the young people. One thing to note, I like to note, is that it is not a country to country, or country by country level. It is at the individual level. I mean, I can totally see that the young generation, they're very much enjoying the Japanese culture and etc. But when it comes to the history, not just even the country level, but when it comes to the history, it is a very different story. And also another factor, very important factor, should be North Korea. So I remember that last year when Gipsonia was, totally collapsed, and then the public opinion poll toward the Gipsonia was not really good, all that great. It's a very negative opinion toward that. But after, I think we did the same question like a month ago or something like that, when there's a third nuclear test done by North Korea and their threat, a lot of provocation was made. The rate of support for Gipsonia was actually increased. So it also very much depends on how they feel about the North Korean threat.